It is April 1st, 2025, and China's foreign minister is in Moscow for 3 days of talks with Russian officials. And the timing of this meeting is incredibly important because as you have Russia and China talking about reaffirming their ties, talking about the importance of their relationship with each other, you also have the US in this position where, although Trump isn't necessarily saying it out loud directly right now, his administration is preparing for war with China. That's according to a recent memo that was leaked from the Pentagon and reported on by the Washington Post. And it's a memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that I really want to get into and to highlight because it's just another reminder of what the Trump administration is doing and how it is handling U.S. foreign policy. We've seen these indications with past speeches coming from Hegseth. Now we're seeing them, according to these reports, at least in writing. And it's not just the US is going to move from a proxy war against Russia to a proxy war against China. Oh no, it's the US wants war with everybody. At least that's how it's coming across based on that memo. I'm very curious to see how this continues to translate into US foreign policy and how countries like Russia and China handle things. We are going to be getting into all of that and more here in today's video. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. And let's start with this report from the Washington Post, citing a memo from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that was sent out to the Pentagon last month, which outlines in broad and sometimes partisan detail, they say, the execution of President Trump's vision to prepare for and win a potential war against Beijing and defend the United States from threats in the near abroad, including Greenland and the Panama Canal. And I just appreciate how only the United States would be actively losing a proxy war against Russia, and then it would be trying to come up with a plan about how it can, quote unquote, win a proxy war against China. Since when in the 21st century has the United States ever won a war? And it's gotten into a lot of them. It's invaded a number of countries, it's overthrown a number of governments, and it's now turned to this form of proxy warfare. And it keeps picking on other countries, not realizing that if you thought a proxy war against Russia didn't turn out how you thought it would, just wait until you're picking one against China. China has even more leverage to use against the US, and the Trump administration does not seem to understand that whatsoever. And this memo also goes on to say that the Trump administration is not just planning to trade Russia for China. Oh no, they have a much bigger plan to take on both of these countries, apparently, just not entirely doing it directly. As the memo states that the Pentagon will assume risk in other theaters, given personnel and resource constraints, and pressure allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to spend more on defense to take on the bulk of the deterrence role against threats from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So this lines up with what we've been talking about and what Hegseth himself has been talking about since back in February. If you remember the meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Brussels that Hegseth went to in person, and that's where he told his European counterparts that the US wanted Europe to step up, to take more responsibility for Ukraine, and to take more of a part in the proxy war against Russia. That way, the US could focus on China. This is something that Brian Berletic of the New Atlas has been talking about. I know he's talked about it when he's been here on my show. And it's interesting because you look at the way that the Trump administration is treating this. And if you look at Donald Trump, you can tell that he is over it dealing with Europe. And I do think that that is legitimate, right? He does not enjoy dealing with Emmanuel Macron of France or Keir Starmer of the UK or Zelensky of Ukraine. It's very clear that Trump is over it. However, you also have to look at the way his administration, and remember, once again, Trump filled his administration with swamp creatures. So whether it's actually Trump, who this is his grand plan and he's just putting on a show for all of us, or whether it's his administration using the fact that he is not a fan of all of these leaders in Europe to their advantage and really kind of playing off of those tensions while going to Europe themselves and telling their allies there, hey, we're still going to work with you. We just need you to ramp up your defense spending and take on more responsibility in this proxy war against Russia. Well, we don't really know yet, but it is interesting to see the way that we are watching this continuity play out through the Trump administration and especially through Pete Hegseth. Now, you may be wondering why China, right? Well, I mean, the US already relies very heavily on China as a major trading partner, whether they like to admit it or not. We saw during the first term of the Trump administration all of this talk about decoupling from China. How's that working out for you? How's that going now, several years later? It's not. I know that the US will act as though there are some ways in which they have reduced reliance on China, right? They want to get their hands on those rare earth minerals in pre 2014 Ukraine that are currently under Russian control because that is about quote unquote reducing reliance on China. But if you look at the bigger picture, it's also a reminder that all roads lead back to China. So even if it's not a proxy war that is specifically launched directly this year or next year or the year after, this is the overall goal for the US neocons as a whole, right? People like Marco Rubio, whether they want to admit it or not, China is their eventual goal. And they see a country like Russia and they're like, well, Russia is a main ally of China. Therefore, hurting Russia hurts China. That's how I would argue from everything that I've seen. That's how they justify it. Even if they don't really get it, even if they don't really necessarily want World War III directly against Russia, they still are taking part. And the Trump administration is a big part of this, taking part in attempting to harm Russia. If they weren't, Trump would have gotten in on and on day one done everything he could to remove the sanctions on Russia, to pull back on military aid from Ukraine, to put an end altogether on intelligence sharing with Ukraine, to pull out the US from its role in making this proxy war against Russia possible. He didn't do that. So clearly, the US is still complicit in waging this proxy war and in continuing to arm Ukraine, even if Trump is not doing everything that he could possibly be doing in this scenario. Now, when it comes to the question of why China, Pete Hegseth also mentions that in this reported memo, in which he says China is the department's sole pacing threat and denial of a Chinese fait accompli seizure of Taiwan while simultaneously defending the U.S. homeland is the department's sole pacing scenario. And I'm sorry, when did Taiwan become part of the United States? Because that statement reads as though Taiwan is the 51st or 52nd state after Israel at this point, and the U.S. is worried about our homeland here and about Taiwan over there. And it's interesting because the wording that Hegseth uses in that memo is to say that China has already decided that they are going to quote unquote seize Taiwan. And I mean, I guess that is true to a certain extent. And the US recognizes that. Under the One China policy, which the US officially recognizes and has for decades now, they see Taiwan as part of China. And that also includes the fact that Taiwan and mainland China are going to be reunified at some point. Now, the US is really fear-mongering on this, right? Acting like it's going to be done by force, doing everything that they can to try to stir the pot, and then saying, oh, well, China's already decided that there's going to be reunification. Therefore, we have to stand up against that. And as they're doing all this, it's like, what is Taiwan to the American people? Nothing. This has nothing to do with the American people. This has nothing to do with our security at home. And it has everything to do with the US finding a way to try to pick a proxy war against China that they know they cannot win. Right? They know that there is no actual victory against China. What is their goal here? To try to harm China? Well, they're certainly going to make China and Russia and a number of other countries even closer. They're certainly going to further the drive for a multipolar world in which countries like Russia and China don't have to worry about one big bully trying to take them on and destroy their economy, and on and on and on. Is that what the US wants? Because that's what they're pursuing right now. And you may be wondering, how is China responding to all of this? Well, according to reports, Beijing staged military drills off Taiwan's north, south, and east coast on Tuesday as a stern warning against separatism. And they called Taiwanese President Lai a parasite as Taiwan sent warships to respond to China's navy approaching its shores. Oh, and this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Moscow for strategic cooperation talks, where he met with Russian President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov and declared that China and Russia are friends forever, never enemies. Now, the timing of this meeting is incredibly important because this is not just your run-of-the-mill visit to prepare for Chinese President Xi Jinping to visit Moscow coming up in May for Victory Day. Oh no, there's a lot more to this one. And there's a lot more to the rhetoric that we're hearing here. Because when you have Chinese officials sitting here saying, friends forever, never enemies, that is a reminder. That is a warning to the West that there is no chance of breaking China and Russia up. That if the Trump administration decided it was going to be all friendly with Russia, while at the same time directing their European allies to continue tensions with Russia, that there is not going to be a world in which the US gets Russia on its side against China. And the US knows that. I do think that they know that. You may have Trump in this position of trying to achieve otherwise, but it's also a reminder that China and Russia are standing together as a united front when it comes to issues involving both of them individually. So, as is the case with the current war in Ukraine, that's why you have China in this position of saying, hey, we care about Russia's security concerns, right? We are going to stand with Russia to make sure that all of their concerns are met before we try to, put pressure on them for some sort of deal, which is, of course, what the US is currently doing on its end. Now, what's also notable here is that if you pay attention to the coverage of Russia-China relations in the mainstream media here in the West, they try to present it as if there's one leader, right? China is doing everything Russia wants. Russia is doing everything China wants. There's no individuality between the two. But when you look at what China has said, well, yes, they are good friends with Russia. They've also made it clear that they have remained neutral in this conflict, whether the media wants to believe that or not. They've also called for an end to this conflict. In fact, China was one of the first, if not the first country, to come up with a version of a peace plan. And that plan did not necessarily make Russia fully happy. It certainly did not make Ukraine or Kiev fully happy. But it was something. It was an attempt by China to say, hey, we actually want to pursue peace. Like, remember the rapprochement that we helped negotiate between Saudi Arabia and Iran that the US had nothing to do with? Yeah, that's the space that China is entering into more and more. Now, it's also interesting to watch the rhetoric here because while we have the US for years now naming China as one of its biggest threats, while we have this leaked reported memo from the Pentagon talking about preparing more with China's taking this cool, calm, and collected when it comes to some of the statements that are being made, at least involving the war in Ukraine. Because on that, we heard from the Chinese foreign minister, and he said that, quote, Russia and the United States have taken the first step toward normalizing relations, which is good for stabilizing the balance of power between major powers and inspiring optimism in a disappointing international situation. So China and Russia are being very careful here, right? They're coming out, they're like, sure, we're all for dialogue. We're all for pursuing the normalization of ties, for pursuing an end to the war in Ukraine. However, we're also making it clear that we stand together, that we are not going to be messed with, and that we are going to stand for each other. Now, as for the topic of where things stand regarding the war in Ukraine and those talks, at this point, it just feels like it depends on the day. It depends on Trump's mood as to how he is approaching things. I mean, he went from saying he was very pissed off at Putin for questioning Zelensky's credibility or his legitimacy one day to then turning around and saying he thinks that Russia will come through on a deal on the next. And then now he's mad at Zelensky again because he thinks that Zelensky is trying to renegotiate this rare earth minerals deal that the US is supposed to sign with Kiev. I mean, it literally is like Trump's mood is just all over the place, and you have to take it day by day and pay attention to what he's actually doing versus just what he's saying. And then you have Russia. Well, Russia's deputy foreign minister, Sergei Ryabkov, made an important point in an interview published on Tuesday when he noted that Russia hasn't heard any signal from Trump to Kiev about ending the war, and that, quote, what we see so far is an attempt to devise a framework that would first lead to a ceasefire as envisioned by the Americans, and then move on to other models and schemes. But as he also noted, the US has yet to address the root causes that led to the war in Ukraine in the first place. And he's 100% right. I mean, the Trump administration right now is continuing to allow the military aid to flow to Kiev. They're continuing to allow intelligence sharing with Ukrainian forces. They are not telling Zelensky, hey, stop this war. Stop this incursion that you're now launching into Russia's Belgorod region after the Kursk incursion fell apart, as if that's going to be some sort of bargaining chip to take to the negotiating table. No, the Trump administration is doing none of that. And it's not indicating it's going to do any of that, unless, of course, it's trying to put pressure on Zelensky for a week, and then maybe it'll take some action or throw out some threats there. But we have yet to see any indication that Trump is actually serious about ending this war, other than him just sitting around talking about it and saying it never should have started to begin with. And it's yet another reminder of why it's so important to pay attention to the Trump administration's actions, or to pay attention to the fact that you have Trump in this position where, despite campaigning on a promise of peace, of ending the war in Ukraine, and on and on and on, what is he actually doing? He's continuing the war in Ukraine by continuing to provide support to Kiev. He's expecting Russia to agree to some sort of frozen conflict where NATO gets to continue to rearm and rebuild Kiev's military for a future war. We have yet to see anything otherwise. But on top of that, Trump is also openly bombing Yemen. He's openly threatening war with Iran. Oh, and now we've got this reported memo saying that the Trump administration plans to continue all of these wars. They just plan for their allies around the world to take on more responsibility so that the US can focus on war with China. This is not what the American people voted for. And it's yet another reminder of the importance of accountability, of reminding Trump for every single day of his presidency that this is the opposite of what he campaigned on, the opposite of what the American people wanted. And that, short of, I guess, full-on World War III with Russia, us coming to that at the end of 2024, we may as well be dealing with Joe Biden in office. Seriously, what would Biden be doing differently? He would still be pursuing tensions with Russia, maybe more so than Trump. I'll give him that. Trump has at least allowed for dialogue, but Biden would still be providing endless support to Israel. He would still be bombing Yemen. He would likely be threatening Iran. And I could also see Biden threatening China. It is yet another reminder that the U.S. establishment continues to remain the U.S. establishment, no matter who the puppet is in the White House. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.